Before sunrise on a cold morning in March 1944, the silence around the Anzio beachhead lasted only a few seconds. Then another German artillery shell exploded across the muddy fields, throwing dirt, broken wood, and twisted metal high into the air. American soldiers had already spent weeks trapped inside a narrow defensive pocket. Every sunrise could become their last. Every movement across open ground was watched by German observers hidden inside ruined farmhouses, church towers, and shattered buildings. One radio message from those observers could bring dozens of shells crashing onto American positions within minutes. Private James Walker pressed himself deeper into the wet earth as another explosion shook the ground. He could hear wounded men crying somewhere behind him, while medics crawled through the smoke, searching for survivors. Nobody spoke louder than a whisper, because every sound felt dangerous. Walker had arrived in Italy only 3 weeks earlier, but the battlefield had already changed him. The confident young mechanic from Ohio was now exhausted, dirty, hungry, and surrounded by death. Every night he wondered if morning would ever come. The veterans told him never to fear the shells you hear, because the dangerous one is always the shell you never hear. At first he laughed when they said it. Now he understood exactly what they meant. As daylight slowly appeared, German artillery became even more accurate. The observers, hidden beyond the American lines, watched every trench, every vehicle, every group of soldiers trying to carry ammunition or food. The moment someone was spotted, coordinates were sent by radio and heavy guns. Answered almost immediately, Walker watched an entire supply truck disappear inside a cloud of smoke and fire. Only moments earlier, the driver had smiled and waved at him. Now, nothing remained except burning debris scattered across the road. Lieutenant Harris gathered several scouts inside a damaged bunker and pointed toward a ruined farmhouse standing alone across the fields. Intelligence believed German artillery observers had occupied the upper floor for several days. Nobody had managed to remove them, because every sniper who fired revealed his own position, and the surviving observers escaped before a second shot could be taken. Walker listened carefully, knowing this mission would become different from everything he had experienced before. Outside, another explosion echoed across the beachhead, while black smoke drifted into the gray morning sky. Somewhere beyond those ruins, unseen men continued directing deadly artillery against thousands of exhausted soldiers, waiting for someone brave enough to stop them.
The order came just before sunset. Walker and 3 experienced scouts left the American trenches, carrying only rifles, binoculars, and enough ammunition for one mission. The muddy ground swallowed every step, making movement painfully slow. Broken trees burned quietly across the shattered landscape, while abandoned helmets and destroyed equipment reminded everyone that hundreds of men had already died, fighting for every meter of ground. Nobody spoke, because even the smallest sound could reveal their position. German machine guns fired short bursts into the darkness, almost at random, forcing the patrol to freeze again and again. Every minute felt like an hour. After nearly 2 hours, they reached the edge of a shell crater, overlooking the ruined farmhouse. Lieutenant Harris slowly raised his binoculars and watched the broken windows. A faint light appeared on the second floor, then disappeared. A few seconds later, another shadow crossed the opening. Walker could barely breathe. He realized the observers were still inside, directing artillery fire even after sunset. Harris quietly counted at least 4 German soldiers moving between radio equipment maps and observation points. Every few minutes, one man lifted his field glasses toward the American lines, while another leaned over a radio, sending fresh coordinates. Somewhere behind the German positions, heavy artillery batteries waited for every message. Those hidden guns had already killed countless Allied soldiers, and they would continue firing until the observers were stopped. Walker rested his rifle across the edge of the crater, but Harris gently lowered the barrel. One shot would only warn the others, he whispered. They needed something different. something faster, something that would leave no time for escape. Suddenly, another American artillery barrage crashed into the hills, behind the farmhouse, shaking the entire battlefield. The noise was deafening. Dust covered the broken walls, and pieces of stone fell from the roof. For a brief moment, every German inside turned toward the explosions. Harris looked at Walker and nodded. The opportunity they had waited for had finally arrived. Across the dark battlefield, history was about to change, not because of a famous general or a massive attack, but because 4 ordinary soldiers were willing to risk everything to silence the eyes that guided the enemy guns. Walker slowly raised his rifle while Lieutenant Harris studied every movement inside the farmhouse. Through the cracked window, they could now see 4 German observers working with calm precision. One marked fresh coordinates across a paper map. Another adjusted binoculars toward the American beachhead, while a radio operator repeated every message without hesitation. Minutes later, another wave of heavy shells exploded behind the Allied lines, proving once again that every report sent from this room meant more men dying. Harris knew waiting any longer would only give the enemy more time. He whispered a simple plan. 2 scouts would move around the eastern side of the farmhouse, while Walker and Harris remained hidden inside the crater. If the Germans noticed movement, everyone would open fire together. There would be no second chance. The patrols separated without another word. Walker watched his companions disappear into the darkness between shattered trees. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the distant artillery. Suddenly, a German sentry stepped outside carrying a rifle. He stretched his shoulders, looked across the silent fields, and lit a cigarette. The tiny flame briefly illuminated his face. Walker kept his finger outside the trigger guard, forcing himself to remain patient. The sentry smoked for less than a minute before walking back inside, leaving the door slightly open. Harris quietly signaled that the moment had come. Across the field, 2 American scouts reached the side wall of the ruined farmhouse, unnoticed. Walker centered his sights on the radio operator inside the second-floor window. Everything became perfectly still. Then a bright flare suddenly rose into the night sky, flooding the battlefield with white light. Every soldier froze. The ruined building, the shell craters, the broken trees, and the crawling scouts became visible for several terrifying seconds. Walker expected machine gun fire at any moment. Instead, the flare slowly faded, and darkness returned. Harris whispered one word. Now 4 American rifles fired almost together. The first German observer collapsed against the radio table. Another fell beside the shattered window. The remaining defenders scrambled for cover as broken glass exploded across the room. Grenades followed. Seconds later, filling the farmhouse with dust, smoke, and splintered wood. When the firing finally stopped, only silence remained. The artillery that had terrorized the beachhead for days suddenly disappeared, and for the first time in weeks, the American lines experienced a dawn without incoming shells. Morning fog covered the battlefield as Walker and the others carefully entered the ruined farmhouse. Smoke still drifted through broken walls, and shattered beams covered the floor. Maps, radios, binoculars, and spent cartridges lay scattered across every room. The German observation post had been destroyed, but its importance was immediately clear. Large maps covered with artillery markings showed nearly every American trench supply route and defensive position. Walker realized the enemy had watched them every hour of every day. Lieutenant Harris gathered every document he could carry, while another scout searched for intelligence hidden inside damaged radio equipment. Outside, the silence felt unfamiliar. No artillery shells landed across the beachhead. Soldiers slowly climbed from muddy foxholes, looking toward the hills, unable to believe the guns had finally stopped. Medics carried wounded men without running for cover. Supply trucks began moving again, across roads that had been impossible to use only hours earlier. For the first time since Walker arrived at Anzio, hope returned to exhausted faces. Throughout the afternoon, officers questioned the patrol, studying every detail of the mission. The captured maps revealed several additional German observation positions hidden among churches, abandoned farms, and rocky hills. American artillery immediately redirected its fire toward those locations, forcing many enemy observers to withdraw before they could organize new defenses. During the following days, Allied infantry advanced farther than anyone expected. Because German artillery no longer struck with the same deadly accuracy, Walker never considered himself a hero. He believed every soldier beside him deserved equal credit because nobody could have completed the mission alone. That evening, he sat outside a damaged bunker, cleaning mud from his rifle while watching the sun disappear behind the shattered hills. Around him, soldiers laughed quietly, shared hot coffee, and spoke about home instead of casualties. It was only one successful patrol in a campaign that would continue for months, yet everyone understood its importance. Sometimes history changed because of massive armies and famous commanders. Sometimes it changed because a handful of determined soldiers crawled through darkness and refused to give up even when every step could have been their last. The battle for Italy would continue, but on that quiet evening, the men of the Anzio beachhead finally believed survival was possible once again. Within 48 hours, the captured documents changed the situation. Across the Anzio beachhead, American artillery commanders compared the German maps with aerial reconnaissance and discovered hidden observation posts that had escaped detection for weeks. Before sunrise, dozens of Allied guns opened fire against abandoned villas, church towers, and isolated farmhouses where enemy observers had directed deadly shelling. Since many German teams had already withdrawn after the raid, their communication network became confused. Radio messages arrived late or not at all. Infantry commanders immediately noticed the difference. Patrols crossed open ground with fewer casualties. Engineers repaired damaged roads, while supply columns finally reached frontline positions without constant artillery attacks. Walker spent most of those days helping reinforce newly captured defensive positions. He watched bulldozers clear wrecked vehicles from muddy roads, while exhausted soldiers strengthened trenches with sandbags, timber, and broken stone. Every hour brought fresh reinforcements, ammunition, medical supplies, and food that previously could not reach the front safely. Although enemy fire still remained dangerous, the endless fear created by invisible observers slowly disappeared. Veterans who had survived months of shelling admitted they had never expected such a sudden change. During one evening briefing, Lieutenant Harris explained that victories were often measured not only by captured ground, but by lives protected. Every observer removed from the battlefield meant dozens of soldiers could return home after the war. Instead of becoming another name on a wooden cross, Walker looked around the crowded bunker and saw tired faces illuminated by a single lantern. Nobody celebrated because everyone understood the fighting was far from over. Yet something inside the men had changed. They no longer believed the enemy controlled every moment of their lives. Confidence slowly returned, and with it came determination to continue advancing through Italy. One successful patrol could never end a war, but it could give thousands of exhausted soldiers the chance to survive another day. By late May, the Allied armies finally prepared to break out from the Anzio beachhead. After months of brutal fighting, thousands of fresh soldiers, tanks, and artillery pieces gathered behind the front lines, waiting for the signal to attack. Walker stood beside his platoon, watching endless columns of vehicles move forward under the cover of darkness. The operation had been planned for weeks. Every commander understood that success depended on speed, surprise, and constant pressure. Before dawn, the sky erupted with the largest artillery barrage Walker had ever witnessed. Hundreds of guns fired together, shaking the earth without pause. Bright flashes stretched across the horizon, while aircraft roared overhead, striking German strongpoints beyond the front line. As the bombardment lifted, American infantry climbed from their trenches and advanced behind armored vehicles through fields that had once been impossible to cross. Enemy resistance remained fierce. Machine guns opened fire from ruined houses. Mortar rounds exploded among advancing troops, and hidden snipers forced entire squads to seek cover. Yet the defenders no longer possessed the accurate observation network that had once made every Allied movement. Deadly communication between German artillery batteries became slower and less effective, allowing American units to continue pushing forward Throughout the day, Walker crossed abandoned trenches, shattered bunkers, and destroyed gun positions. Many German soldiers surrendered after realizing their defensive lines had been broken. Others withdrew toward the north, hoping to establish new positions before Allied armor reached them. Late that afternoon, Walker climbed a small ridge overlooking the battlefield. Smoke drifted across the valley, where weeks earlier, constant shell fire had trapped thousands of exhausted men. Now long columns of Allied vehicles stretched toward the horizon, continuing the advance without stopping. Lieutenant Harris quietly joined him and looked across the open ground. "We made it farther today than anyone believed possible," he said. Walker nodded without answering because he remembered the terrible mornings when every step had brought another explosion. The road ahead remained dangerous, and the war was far from finished. But the beachhead that had once seemed like a prison had finally become the starting point of victory. The breakthrough at Anzio opened the road toward Rome, and Allied forces continued advancing through central Italy. Day after day, Walker marched north beside thousands of other soldiers, passing abandoned German defenses, destroyed bridges and villages, left almost empty by months of fighting. Civilians slowly emerged from cellars carrying white cloths and greeting the arriving troops. Many offered breadwater or simply quiet smiles. After living under constant fear for so long, Walker accepted a small loaf from an elderly woman who thanked him through tears, although neither of them understood the other's language. The war had taken nearly everything from these families, yet they still found the strength to welcome strangers who brought hope. As the advance continued, resistance became scattered. German units fought delaying actions before withdrawing towards stronger defensive positions farther north. Engineers built temporary bridges across damaged rivers, while medical teams treated both Allied soldiers and wounded civilians. Walker often looked back at the long roads stretching toward Anzio, remembering the days when every mile had been covered by enemy artillery fire. Now those same roads carried endless columns of trucks, fuel, ammunition, and fresh supplies, supporting an army that finally held the initiative. One afternoon, the platoon reached a hill overlooking the distant skyline of Rome. Bells echoed across nearby villages, while aircraft circled high above the ancient city. Officers reminded every soldier that the campaign was not over, and many difficult battles still waited ahead, but everyone understood they were witnessing one of the most important moments of the Italian campaign. Walker quietly removed his helmet and looked toward the horizon, thinking about friends who had fallen during the long months at Anzio. Their sacrifice had made this advance possible, and every step forward honored the memory of those who would never return home. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time since landing in Italy, the future no longer seemed controlled by fear. It belonged to those who had endured the impossible and continued moving forward. On the 4th day of June, 1944, Allied troops entered Rome, becoming the first Axis capital liberated during the war. Church bells rang across the city as civilians filled the streets, waving flags, embracing soldiers, and celebrating the end of months of occupation. Walker walked slowly through narrow stone streets, unable to believe the silence. No artillery echoed across the rooftops. No smoke covered the sky. No observers searched the horizon with binoculars. Children ran beside American vehicles, while families stepped from damaged buildings, holding flowers, bread, and handwritten messages of gratitude. Many soldiers smiled for the first time in months, but their celebration remained quiet because everyone remembered those who had fallen before reaching this moment. Walker stopped near an ancient square and watched elderly civilians thank young soldiers who had crossed oceans to fight for a country that was not their own. The victory belonged to thousands of ordinary men whose names would never appear in history. Books, mechanics, farmers, teachers, factory workers, and students had stood together through fear, hunger, exhaustion, and endless battles until the impossible became reality. That evening, Walker opened a small notebook he had carried since leaving America. He wrote only one sentence: "We made it because we never stopped moving forward." He closed the notebook and looked toward the setting sun, knowing another campaign still waited beyond the mountains. The war would continue across Europe for many more months, bringing new battles and new sacrifices. Yet the lessons learned at Anzio would never disappear. Courage was not the absence of fear, it was the decision to continue despite it. History often remembered famous generals and great victories, but it was built by ordinary soldiers who refused to abandon one another. When everything seemed lost, their determination changed the course of the campaign and helped bring freedom back to millions of people. Across the quiet streets of Rome, Walker finally allowed himself to believe that one day he would return home, carrying not only memories of war, but proof that hope could survive even the darkest moments of history.